Demography, Part A. The key concepts here are: what is a population? What are the key quantitative characteristics of a population? And how do populations change in time and space? First of all, what is a population? Simply put, a population is a group of individuals of a single species inhabiting a particular area. For instance, maybe the moose on this island, or fish of a particular species such as sunfish in a pond. Those would be populations. Populations are often defined by boundaries, that is, by their edges. It's important to determine boundaries because individuals are not homogeneously distributed across the landscape. They are often, as we'll see, clumped together. Population boundaries can be determined by differences in demographic characteristics, that is, demography. They can be the number of individuals, the spatial distribution of those individuals, the reproductive rate of individuals in the population, or even the way the population is isolated or connected to one another. For example, in this photograph and the accompanying graph, we see a white-footed mouse population found in old growth forest, in young forest, and in the forest patch. And although it's all the same population because they may be more or less connected, we can see that perhaps the old forest and young forest are more easily connected than the forests and the forest patch. There can be differences, is what I'm getting at. And we need to be cognizant of that when we talk about a population. That is, a population may have small clusters within it over the landscape. Okay? When we talk about populations, there's really two kinds of populations, or two sort of aspects of a population. One is the ecological population, which is a group of individuals of a species that occupy a defined area. That's sort of the traditional way we think of a population. The boundaries will be determined by ecologically relevant changes in the environment, the edge of a pond, the edge of a forest as it gives way to a field. Those would be the boundaries, and that would define an ecological population. An evolutionary population is a local group of individuals that mate at random. In genetics, that's referred to as a deme. The boundaries of a deme, or an evolutionary population, are determined by barriers to mating and gene flow. As you can see, an ecological population and an evolutionary population overlap, but there are subtle differences. Natural selection leads to the addition or losses of individuals of certain genotypes in the population. In other words, individuals that have characteristics that promote their survival and reproduction will be favored. Those that do not have those characteristics will be selected against. Therefore, natural selection has demographic effects. And the contribution of an individual to the population is really the per capita difference between the contribution of that individual in the future and how that population would grow without that individual. So the presence or absence of that individual, what difference does that make? That's the really contribution an individual makes to the population. The take home from these sort of concepts so far is that a population is defined on the basis of demographic discontinuities, that is, demographic features that distinguish one group from another. The evolutionary population, or deme, is the unit within which evolution occurs, and a deme is a randomly mating group of individuals. Now, let's talk about population and see how we might be able to quantify the population. In fact, determining characteristics of a population is what the term demography refers to. One of the first things we talk about in demography is the size of a population, that is, the number of individuals we're dealing with. We can do this in a couple of different ways. For instance, if possible, that is, if you have large animals or animals that have limited or predictable movement, you might do a total census, where you simply go out and count all the individuals. On the other hand, if the individuals are plants or attached sessile organisms or territorial organisms, you might find it feasible to delineate a certain geographic area, sort of a square footage or square meter area and count the individuals in that specific geographic area and then extrapolate to determine the total population size. If it turns out the population is very, very small or very mobile or very secretive, it might be necessary to use something called the Lincoln mark recapture method, which is basically, as the term would suggest, you capture a subset of the population, you mark those individuals, you release them back into the environment, and then you continue to trap and capture individuals, and then using a formula which examines the ratio of the number of recaptured, that is marked individuals, as a proportion of those that are unmarked, you can calculate and actually come up with a very accurate estimate of population. So quantifying population size often depends on the organisms that you're trying to quantify. The other thing that we'll notice with regard to a demographic characteristic is the spatial distributions of individuals. We can roughly classify those into three. Now, please understand, these are three characteristics to sort of understand the principles. A population, a particular spatial distribution of a population may not adhere exactly to one of these three categories, okay? The random, as shown in the first tile at the top of the slide, is going to be a condition where the finding of one organism does not in any way really influence the finding of another organism. They're randomly distributed. Often this is because of random distribution of resources within an environment, and may also be the result of what are referred to as neutral interactions among the individuals of the population. They just don't really care whether other organisms are around. We can have clumped conditions, which are positive interactions occur among individuals. There might be some society or social interaction that takes place that brings the individuals together. Or it might be that the resources are clumped. That is, these organisms might be found around the edge of a pond, or a watering hole in the desert, or the top of a mountain, whatever the case may be. This causes them to be clumped, to be aggregated together within the environment. And finally, we have what's referred to as a regular distribution, and in this case we simply have them sort of maybe not exactly lined up in rows and columns as this figure indicates, but the idea that they're more or less uniformly or regularly distributed throughout the population. This occurs when there's territoriality involved, and we'll talk about territoriality, well, we've talked about it a little bit already, and also aggressive interactions among organisms where they may even repel each other so that they stay away from each other. It turns out that all three of these can be found in the natural world. I'll tip you off, since this isn't a mystery. Clumped is typically the most common type of distribution of individuals. Probably the rarest would be regular, with random falling somewhere in between. But again, it's species specific. Notice, as I just said, dispersion or spatial distribution is in fact species specific, and you can see here there's the dots are representing individuals in a particular population. As you can see, they are distributed differently, but again, what I would suggest, if you look at the pattern, you see most of them are what I would call clumped. Although I guess the pattern might vary a little bit from one organism to another. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about population size or census, and a little bit about their spatial distribution. Other things that we want to consider are age structure, sex structure, that is, sex ratio, variations in the individual reproduction and survival. Let's look at age structures. The age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals among various ages. Now, I know I say people here because I'm using human examples, but it could be rabbits or horses or whatever. Usually we use a graphical analysis, and these graphical analysis can provide insight into the ecology, history, and future of the population. If we look at this top diagram here, we see that we can often divide the population just into three categories. Those that are too young to reproduce, pre-reproductive, those that are of reproductive age, reproductives, and those that are past reproductive age, post-reproductives. And depending on the relative proportion of those three categories, post-reproductive, reproductive, and pre-reproductive, we can make some predictions with regard to the overall growth potential of a population. Now let's look at the lower diagram. Kenya shows again, this graph is very much the same. The only thing that's different here is they've divided it, instead of just into the three categories with regard to reproduction, they went by, it looks like 4-year intervals here, but it's the same idea. If we look at Kenya, as I was saying, at the bottom we see that the bottom part of the graph is the largest part of the graph, the pre-reproductives. These individuals are going to grow up and become reproductives. So when you see the shape of a graph such as the one in Kenya, we know that population is going to probably be looking at growth in the future, because the large number of young people will move into reproductive age and have children and so forth. So when you have that sort of nice pyramid look, you can say a population is poised for population growth. If you look at Sweden, we see that here it sort of narrows in at the bottom. It's pretty uniform, but at the bottom it narrows in a little bit. It's sort of tucked in, so that the proportion of pre-reproductives is somewhat lower than the other categories. A population that shows this kind of shape is one that is likely to show either a stable or even slightly declining population. So it's declining. Why? Because as the reproductives move to post-reproductive, the pre-reproductives grow up, but there's a smaller number of them to replace them, so the potential for population growth declines. Finally, the United States, we see that there's a sort of bulge in the center, so there's going to be some reproduction taking place, and then the rest of them are pretty much uniform, indicating what would be almost a stable population. So we have Kenya, a rapidly growing population, the United States, close to, or at least slowing down. It may not be at zero growth, but slowing down to a slower growth, and Sweden actually showing the shape where it's indented at the bottom a little bit, where there might even be a declining population. So again, these age structure diagrams are important because they can provide us with insights into what's happening in the population. The take-home so far now, okay, to sort of review, is the number of individuals in some populations is going to be measured directly, either by direct census and tallying. In others, you'll have to use indirect methods such as capture, release, and recapture. The dispersion or distribution pattern reflects important ecological forces acting on the spatial distribution of individuals, and the age structure of a population reveals key patterns of mortality and reproduction.